I was driving to hear my son's last will and testament when I got in the car, and my neighbor tapped on the window with a strange urgency in his eyes and a weight in his stare that made my chest tighten as though the air itself had thickened around me. His hand shook slightly as he leaned closer, lowering his voice like someone afraid of being overheard. "You don't know the truth," he whispered, his lips trembling. "Ask who really wrote that will." My hands froze on the steering wheel, and for a moment my breath caught. The car engine was rumbling softly beneath me, but it felt as if the world had gone silent, like the earth itself was holding its breath. My neighbor stepped back quickly, and without another word walked away down the street, his shoulders stiff, his head turning once as though to check if anyone had seen him. I stared after him, stunned, unable to move. If you want to hear more stories that peel back layers of betrayal and revenge until the truth is impossible to ignore, then don't miss out. Tap subscribe right now and stay with me until the end. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles burned white and the leather groaned under my fingers. The words repeated in my head like a curse. Who really wrote that will? My son had only been gone for weeks. His car had skidded off the road late at night. That was what they told me. That was the story everyone accepted. But I had not accepted it. I had tried to bury my doubt under grief. I had tried to convince myself that the accident was real, that fate was cruel, that the universe had taken him without reason. And yet, with a single whisper from my neighbor, everything I had tried to force myself to believe was unraveling like old fabric. The road stretched out before me as I pulled away from the curb. Every stop sign glared like an accusation. Every streetlight cut sharp shadows across the windshield that seemed to mock me with hidden shapes. My mind kept drifting back to the last time I saw my son alive, his face dimly lit by his phone, his words clipped, his smile absent. He had changed in those final months. He had become distant, secretive, as though carrying a burden he could not share with me. I told myself it was just adulthood pulling him away from his father, but now I realized it was more. It had always been more. The lawyer's office was 15 miles away, but each mile dragged like a lifetime. My hands were slick with sweat on the wheel. My chest tightened every time I thought about what I might hear. The will was supposed to be simple. He had no wife, no children. It should come to me or his mother, divided between blood. But now a new possibility lodged itself in my brain like a thorn. What if he had been coerced? What if someone had manipulated him? What if that stranger who had appeared around him in recent months, the one I had dismissed as just a business acquaintance, was more than that? I pulled into the parking lot at last and sat there, unable to move. The building loomed above me, its glass windows glowing faintly against the fading evening light. It looked sterile, clean, official, yet to me it looked like a stage set for betrayal. I took a deep breath, unbuckled my seatbelt, and forced myself inside. The receptionist's smile was polite, but her eyes flickered nervously when I gave my name. She led me down a narrow hallway into a small room where a few people were already waiting. My ex-wife sat stiffly at one end of the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her lips drawn so tightly they looked bloodless. She didn't meet my eyes, but I didn't expect her to. Across from her sat my son's closest friend from childhood, head bowed, hands restless in his lap. He looked hollow, guilt-ridden even. And then, at the far end of the table, sat a man I had never seen before. His suit was pressed too perfectly. His posture was too relaxed. His eyes met mine for a moment longer than polite, and in that stare I saw something I could not name, but could feel in my bones: possession, victory, arrogance. The lawyer entered carrying a thick envelope and a folder of papers. His face was pale, his jaw tight, as though he carried the weight of a secret that threatened to crush him. He cleared his throat and began reading. The words blurred, but the meaning stabbed. My son had left the majority of his estate, his accounts, his home, not to me, not to his mother, but to that stranger sitting smugly across the table. A cold wave crashed over me. My stomach lurched. The room tilted as though the ground had shifted beneath us all. My son's best friend lifted his head just enough to glance at me, eyes wide with something like shame. My ex-wife did not move, her face frozen like a mask. The stranger leaned back slightly, his lips twitching in a faint smile that he tried to hide, but not very hard. The lawyer droned on about conditions, distributions, signatures. I tried to listen, but all I could hear was the echo of my neighbor's voice. Who really wrote that will? My son's signature appeared on the papers, yes. But in my mind I saw him sitting alone, pressured, forced, maybe even threatened. My heart thudded so hard it hurt. When the reading ended, the room buzzed with whispers. The stranger signed quickly, almost eagerly. My ex-wife excused herself in a cold rush. My son's friend muttered something about needing air and slipped outside. I sat there frozen, my hands trembling on my knees, my throat dry. Rage and grief tangled inside me until I could not tell them apart. Finally, I stood and walked out into the night air. The cool breeze hit me like ice, but did not calm me. I reached for my phone, dialed my neighbor's number, but he didn't answer. I called again. Nothing. The silence on the other end was louder than any sound. I stood there, staring into the dark parking lot, and in that moment my grief hardened into something else. I had lost my son once to death, but now I felt as though I was losing him again to a theft so cruel it made the ground beneath me shake. If this was a game, I would play it. If this was a war, I would fight it. That stranger thought he had taken everything, but he had no idea what was coming for him. I returned home from that night outside his mansion, with my heart pounding like a war drum. Every detail I had collected swirled in my mind, building a picture of the man who had stolen my son's peace and ultimately his life. The more I pieced it together, the more I realized he was not some ordinary leech. He was calculated, dangerous, ruthless, and yet, like all men who believe themselves untouchable, he had blind spots. His arrogance was the very weapon I would turn against him. I knew I could not take him on directly. The law was twisted in his favor. His lawyers, his money, his reach would crush me before I even stood a chance. So I decided I would not fight him where he was strongest. I would drag him into the shadows, into the spaces where men like him thought no one could touch them. That is where his empire would crumble. For weeks, I shadowed his movements. He went to the same restaurants, always ordering expensive wine, laughing too loud, showing off as though the world was his stage. He visited my son's house like it was his own trophy, standing on the balcony with a drink in his hand as if he had conquered something worth celebrating. He carried himself like a king, but I saw through it. Every king can be dethroned. One night, I followed him to a club on the outskirts of the city. He walked in with 2 women on his arms, flashing his money like it was nothing, slipping wads of cash into the hands of the doorman. I stayed in the shadows, watching, waiting. Inside, he drank until his arrogance turned to recklessness. He bragged loudly, to anyone who would listen, about how easy it was to make people bend to his will. He laughed about weak men who signed papers without even reading them. He called them fools. My fists clenched. He was talking about my son, but I did not move. Not yet. Revenge is not served in haste. It is brewed slowly, like poison. I began to collect proof. I printed every email, every threat. I spoke to my neighbor again, convincing him to tell me everything he had seen, this time recording his words on a small device I kept in my pocket. I visited my son's friend once more, asking him to write down what he knew, his memories of the threats, the fear. Piece by piece, I built a case. But I did not take it to the police. I knew the system would bury it, twist it, turn it into nothing. No, my plan was different. My plan was to break him in the court of public opinion, to tear away the mask he wore in front of the world. I learned that he was close to securing a massive deal, one that would make him even richer, more powerful. He was hosting an event, inviting the press, flaunting his wealth and influence. That was when I decided the stage he loved so much would become the place of his downfall. On the night of the event, I slipped into the crowd wearing a simple suit, blending in with the dozens of guests who had come to bask in his glory. Cameras flashed. Laughter echoed. The man stood at the center, smiling like a wolf among sheep, shaking hands, making promises, pretending to be a pillar of success. But I knew the truth, and I held it in my hands. When he raised his glass to make a toast, I stepped forward. My voice was steady, though my heart raced. I said his name loudly, so all eyes turned. The room fell silent. He smirked, as if amused by my interruption. That was his mistake. I pulled out the folder of papers, the emails, the threats, the testimonies. I read them aloud, my voice echoing through the hall. Gasps filled the room. Whispers spread like fire. His smirk faltered, his eyes darting desperately from face to face as the weight of the truth crashed down on him. I told them how he had blackmailed my son, how he had stolen everything through fear and lies, how he had driven a good man to despair. I told them that while he drank wine in luxury, my son's grave was still fresh in the ground. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras turned from him to me. Guests who once praised him now looked at him with disgust. He tried to laugh it off, to dismiss me as a bitter old man, but the evidence spoke louder than his arrogance. The truth had been unleashed, and there was no cage that could contain it now. Within days, the story spread like wildfire. His name, once praised, became a curse. His deal collapsed. His so-called friends abandoned him. His empire began to rot from the inside, piece by piece. The house he had stolen from my son was swarmed with protesters. His businesses lost clients. Investors pulled out. Partners fled. He was left standing in the ruins of the kingdom he had built on lies. I watched it all unfold, not with joy, but with grim satisfaction. This was not victory. This was justice. My son's voice, silenced too soon, now roared through every headline, every whispered conversation, every ruined contract that dragged that man lower and lower until he was nothing more than a shadow of the tyrant he once was. One evening, I returned to my son's grave. The air was cool, the grass damp beneath my shoes. I stood in silence, staring at the stone carved with his name. My hands trembled, not with rage this time, but with sorrow. I told him what I had done. I told him the man who had tormented him was finished, destroyed by his own greed and cruelty. I told him I was sorry for not seeing the truth sooner, for not protecting him when he needed me most. Tears fell freely, soaking the earth. But I also told him something else. I told him that as long as I lived, I would never let his name be forgotten, that the world would remember him not as a man broken by threats, but as a son who loved too fiercely, who gave everything to protect his family, and that his father had avenged him, not with fists or bullets, but with truth. As I walked away from the grave, a strange peace settled over me. The war was over. The man who had stolen my son's future was nothing but ash in the wind. My grief would never leave me, but at least now it had purpose. And in that quiet moment, I realized something. Revenge is not about rage. It is about balance. And finally, after so much pain, the scales had been set right. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more and like this video.